He was there, undeniable. A black man in a space designed to make him feel small without saying it out loud. The air carried a hush that wasn't respect but expectation. Know your place, keep your head down, be grateful for what you're given. He knew that tone. He'd heard it his whole life. The flight attendant's warning smile. The passengers' sidelong glances that didn't have to say, "Not one of us," to mean exactly that. They wanted him silent, invisible, humiliated enough to forget he had every right to be there. But this wasn't a story about quiet surrender. This was about the price of that smug certainty when you underestimate the wrong man. About what happens when the target of your contempt has the power to turn one small act of petty cruelty into a billion-dollar disaster. Watch how the cabin meant to exclude him became the stage for their own downfall. Like if you want to see what real consequences look like. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. And drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what you think of this story. Let's talk about the lines no one admits are there. Calvin Mercer trudged onto the plane, sweat drying uncomfortably on the back of his plain navy t-shirt that had faded over countless washes. The seams of his jeans frayed from years of wear. He gripped his battered canvas backpack as if it were a shield, fingers white-knuckled around the strap. The gate agent hadn't even looked up when scanning his ticket, mumbling a disinterested thanks that felt more like dismissal. Calvin had nodded anyway out of habit, forcing the smallest smile that quickly died on his lips. His eyes darted around the jet bridge as he stepped into the plane, the cold blast of recycled air hitting him in the face like a warning. First class was cool, quiet, and softly lit, the plush leather seats wide and spaced apart in muted charcoal and cream. Passengers in pressed shirts and polished shoes flipped through business magazines or scrolled on their phones without glancing up. The hush in the air broken only by the muted clink of ice in real glass tumblers. He paused at the row markers, locating his seat, 2A, his heart thudding. It felt unreal. The ticket had cost him more than he wanted to admit, but he told himself it was worth it just once. To have legroom, to not be jostled or looked like he was less. He inched down the aisle carefully, making sure not to bump anyone with his bag. Two white men in polo shirts stood in the aisle talking about golf trips, one of them gesturing broadly. Calvin waited behind them for a moment, clearing his throat gently. They didn't move. He tried again, voice lower, almost apologetic. "Excuse me." Neither bothered to look at him. He shifted his backpack, trying to make himself smaller, maneuvering past carefully so as not to brush them. But his bag caught on one man's elbow, sending a splash of his drink onto the seat. The man snapped his head around, glaring. "Watch it," he barked. Calvin swallowed hard. "Sorry," he said immediately, voice cracking. He turned away, trying to vanish, squeezing into his seat area and popping the overhead bin to stow the backpack. His hands trembled slightly as he pushed the worn canvas up and in, making sure it lay flat so no one would complain. That's when he heard it, a sharp, condescending voice that seemed to slice through the cabin. "Hey, don't block the aisle." Calvin's heart dropped. He froze halfway through adjusting the bag. He turned to see the flight attendant standing behind him. She was middle-aged, with a crisp uniform that looked like it had been ironed straight onto her body. Hair yanked into a bun, so tight it seemed to pinch her temples. Her name tag read Darla in neat black letters. Her mouth was set in a grim line, eyes cool and judgmental. Calvin's own eyes flicked past her to the two men still chatting behind her, blocking the entire aisle without shame. She didn't even glance at them. Calvin felt heat rise to his face. He dropped his eyes. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, shoving the backpack one last time and snapping the bin shut. He all but fell into his seat, trying to make himself small. Darla didn't move. She stood there for another second, eyes lingering on him like he was something on her shoe. Then she huffed and turned, brushing past the two men without a word, who didn't even stop their conversation. Calvin's face burned. He sank deeper into the seat, hands locked together so tight they hurt. He willed himself to be invisible. The soft announcements about safety procedures and pre-flight checks blurred into static in his head. A few minutes passed, the engine's steady hum filling the space. He tried to look normal, tried to look like he belonged there. Darla came back down the aisle, scanning the cabin with an expression that made it clear this was her domain. She stopped at his row again. Calvin felt his stomach clench. She looked at his feet. His backpack was tucked neatly under the seat in front of him, the top of it barely peeking out by an inch. She leaned in closer, so close he could smell the harsh floral detergent of her uniform. "Sir, your bag needs to be all the way under the seat," she said, voice syrupy, but with a blade underneath. He blinked at her. "It is," he whispered. She raised an eyebrow, not breaking eye contact. "All the way. Don't make me repeat myself." His mouth went dry. He hooked his foot around the strap and shoved it with unnecessary force, sending it crashing into the metal frame under the seat in front. The entire row shuddered. She didn't even flinch. "Good," she said coldly. Then she added, voice dropping so only he could hear, but loud enough for the man in 2B to smirk. "Try not to make trouble this time, okay?" The words knocked the air from his lungs. He blinked rapidly, confused and humiliated. This time, watched her lean in with that smile that wasn't a smile and say words meant to strip the skin from his dignity. Watched him nod and submit and say nothing at all. He'd felt their eyes burning holes in his side, some with embarrassment on his behalf, others with smug satisfaction. The silence that followed had become its own condemnation, the unspoken agreement that there was nothing wrong with what they'd witnessed because it hadn't happened to them. As the plane rose through banks of cloud and the city lights fell away below, Calvin fought the claustrophobic press of the seat against his ribs. He tried to focus on breathing, on the memory of what had pushed him to buy this ticket in the first place. The promise of a new job in the city, a chance to start over, to rebuild after years of scraping by. This one flight was supposed to be a reward, a small taste of dignity and peace. Instead, he felt exposed, shivering from something colder than the conditioned air. He shifted uncomfortably, knees pressed painfully against the seat in front of him, and realized with a creeping dread that his muscles were locking up. The old injury in his lower back, the one he'd picked up on a warehouse floor years ago, was screaming at him with every breath. He needed to stand, just for a moment, stretch, take pressure off his spine before it seized up and left him gasping in pain. He waited. He counted to 20. He watched Darla disappear behind the first-class curtain toward the galley. Then he exhaled and slowly, carefully, pushed himself up from the seat, hands braced against the armrests so he didn't rock or disturb anyone. He winced as he straightened. The relief was instant but fragile, his lower back popping with a dull crack. He stepped into the aisle cautiously, spine still curved slightly as he tried to ease the tension. He kept his arms tight to his sides, head down, pretending not to see the man in 2B glancing at him with open disdain. He pressed his eyes shut for one heartbeat, drawing in slow, deliberate air. He felt human again, barely. But the moment was short-lived. The sound of brisk, angry footsteps snapped through the hush of first class like a whip. He opened his eyes in time to see Darla striding back down the aisle, expression twisted in unmistakable fury. Her voice was high and sharp, a blade scraping glass. "Sit down, now." The words cracked like a gunshot. The entire cabin fell silent. Conversations died instantly. Heads turned like they were on strings, passengers gawking openly. Calvin flinched. His mouth fell open in shock. He swallowed hard, words failing him as his heart slammed in his chest. He tried to speak, voice shaking. I'm sorry, I just needed to." But she wasn't listening. She advanced on him, eyes locked on his face, her lip curled in disgust. She stopped so close he could smell her powdery perfume. "What did I tell you about causing trouble? Sit down now, or I'll have you removed." Calvin blinked rapidly, his breathing ragged. He felt the burn behind his eyes. He bit his tongue, so hard it hurt, trying to hold in the sob that threatened to burst free. His back spasmed, and he winced, clutching the armrest. "Please," he said, voice cracking. "My back. I just needed to stand for a second." Darla's mouth tightened to a cruel line. She leaned in closer, so everyone could hear. "I don't want your excuses. Sit." She pointed at his seat like he was a dog. Calvin's face burned. He felt every eye on him. He couldn't move fast enough, half falling back into the seat with a grunt of pain. He hunched over, humiliated beyond words, hands gripping his knees so tight his nails left crescents in the denim. His vision swam. He heard the first whispers from the passengers around him. Some sounded embarrassed, others disgusted, but none of them spoke up for him. Darla lingered over him, looming like a shadow. "Unbelievable," she said loudly. "Always looking for trouble." Calvin shook his head frantically, the words tumbling out, desperate. I didn't, I'm sorry." She didn't reply. She turned away, but not before delivering one final blow. She tapped the intercom handset beside the galley door and pressed the button. Her voice boomed through the cabin speakers, echoing, filling every corner. "Attention security. We have a non-compliant passenger in row 14. The words hung in the air like a sentence. Calvin's mouth fell open in horror. He felt the blood drain from his face. The cabin fell even quieter, if such a thing was possible. The whispers grew sharper now, urgent. Someone cleared their throat uncomfortably. Someone else let out a soft scoff. He kept his head low, his breathing shallow, trying to make himself as small as possible. He felt stripped of everything, of dignity, of voice, of the small comfort he'd hoped to claim with the overpriced ticket. The silence in the cabin pressed against him from all sides, a suffocating weight of unspoken judgment and embarrassment. Somewhere, someone coughed politely. A woman rustled a magazine, pretending to be absorbed in an article she hadn't even turned the page on for 5 minutes. 2 businessmen whispered to each other, leaning in with self-satisfied smirks, their eyes flicking to him only to quickly slide away. He heard one mutter something that sounded like always a problem, and the other stifled a laugh behind his hand. Calvin's stomach twisted. He blinked rapidly, refusing to let the tears welling at the corners of his eyes fall. He'd never felt so exposed, so out of place. He hated that he'd thought this would be different, that he'd let himself believe, even for a moment, that first class was a space he could occupy without question. He tried to focus on the small window beside him, watching ground crew vehicles trundle across the tarmac, their blinking orange lights a distant, indifferent glow. He wondered if he could will himself into the seat so completely that he might vanish. He was still trying when he heard the commotion at the front of the cabin. The door had opened again. 2 security staff climbed aboard, men who looked like they'd been picked precisely for their bulk and intimidating presence. Their navy jackets were stretched tight over their shoulders, badges gleaming under the cabin lights, radios crackling quietly at their belts. One of them scanned the cabin quickly, eyes sharp and impersonal, like he was reading a report rather than looking at people. The other spoke into his shoulder mic, confirming they'd arrived. Calvin felt his pulse spike, his breath catching. The memory of Darla's voice over the intercom rang in his head. "We have a non-compliant passenger in row 14. It echoed and echoed, mocking him. He tried to shrink further into the seat, but there was nowhere to go. The security men didn't even have to ask. Darla emerged from the galley with a triumphant set to her shoulders, her mouth drawn in that same humorless line, and pointed directly at Calvin without hesitation. "That's him," she said clearly, her voice cutting through the cabin's low murmur with surgical precision. The words felt like a slap. Calvin wanted to protest. He wanted to tell them he'd done nothing, that he'd only stood up because his back was seizing, that he'd apologized a dozen times. But his voice died in his throat as both men turned to face him, blocking the aisle with their broad frames, their eyes unreadable. "Sir," one of them said in a flat, rehearsed voice, "we need you to stay in your seat. Don't move." Calvin opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He swallowed, tasting acid. He could only nod, blinking rapidly, his fingers clenched tighter around the armrests. The second man leaned down slightly, voice pitched just loud enough for everyone in the surrounding rows to hear. "One more outburst," he warned slowly, each word deliberate and heavy. "And you're off this plane. Understand?" Calvin's face went hot. The humiliation spread through his body like wildfire. He nodded again, eyes blurring, unable to look at them. He felt his chest hitch, a dry, rasping sob caught in his throat that he forced down with sheer will. The security men didn't wait for a response. They straightened, gave Darla a perfunctory nod, and turned back to the door, speaking into their radios as they left. The hush in the cabin was now a dead, oppressive thing, so thick it felt hard to breathe. Calvin felt the eyes on him. He knew what they saw, a problem, a troublemaker, someone who couldn't behave. He tried to sink further down in the seat, as if the headrest might swallow him whole. Darla stayed behind, surveying the cabin like a warden. She ran her eyes over the passengers, then settled them on the row behind Calvin. She smiled, but it was cold and brittle. "Thank you for your patience," she said in that practiced, professional tone, but she didn't bother lowering her voice, ensuring Calvin could hear every word. "I'm sorry for the disruption. Some people just don't know how to act in first class." A ripple of uncomfortable shifting ran through the seats. Someone coughed. Another person cleared their throat. No one said anything. Calvin felt like he'd been punched in the chest. He blinked hard, his eyes burning so badly he had to press them shut. He bit the inside of his cheek until he tasted blood. The hush in the cabin had shifted into something worse than silence, a shared, almost tangible condemnation that weighed on him like a lead blanket. Conversations were whispers now, half-finished sentences hanging in the air as people pretended not to look but kept stealing glances at him, eyes darting away when they caught him noticing. The two security men had left, but their threat clung to him like a brand. One more outburst and you're off this plane. Darla had disappeared behind the galley curtain after her parting shot about people not knowing how to act, leaving Calvin to marinate in the poisonous mix of anger, shame, and helplessness. He replayed her words over and over, each time flinching inwardly, as if slapped. He tried to calm himself, to steady his breathing, but every inhale felt ragged, every exhale like surrender. He told himself to think about the city he was flying to, the new job waiting for him, the tiny apartment he'd barely been able to afford. But even those thoughts were tainted now. He could imagine arriving there already broken, carrying the memory of this flight with him forever. He felt less than, unworthy, like the seat itself was trying to eject him for daring to sit in it. Just when he thought the worst was over, that if he kept perfectly still he might be able to endure the flight in humiliated silence, the curtain parted sharply and Darla re-emerged. She didn't even look at him this time, just turned her head slightly and signaled with a short jerk of her chin. Calvin's stomach turned to ice. A new figure stepped through the curtain. A tall man in a navy suit with brass wings pinned to his lapel and a laminated badge reading Flight Manager. He had the bland, practiced expression of someone who'd spent too many years in customer service without ever actually caring about the customers. He stopped in front of Calvin's row and glanced down at him with clinical detachment, as if examining a stain on the carpet. "Sir," he began, voice even but cold, "I've received multiple reports of a disruptive passenger in this cabin." Calvin swallowed hard, his throat so dry he wasn't sure he could speak. He forced his voice out anyway, low and shaking. "I didn't do anything. I just stood up because my back hurt." He stopped himself before he could say too much, biting down hard enough on his tongue to taste copper. The flight manager raised a single eyebrow, unimpressed. "Regardless of your reasons, you've made several customers uncomfortable. I need you to understand that we have a responsibility to ensure all passengers feel safe and respected." Calvin's mouth dropped open. He felt like he'd been punched in the chest. Safe? Respected? His hands shook on the armrests. He tried to keep his voice even, but it cracked anyway. "I haven't threatened anyone. I haven't yelled. I just asked her why she was yelling at me. That's all. Please. I'm not trying to cause problems." The flight manager didn't react except for a slight narrowing of his eyes. "Sir, at this time I'm going to ask you to apologize to Ms. Darla for your behavior." Calvin blinked at him. His heart seemed to stop, then pound twice as hard. Apologize? For what? For existing? For having a back injury? For wanting to not be treated like trash? He opened his mouth, then shut it. His face flushed, so red he thought it might burst. He tried again, voice raw. "I didn't do anything wrong. She's the one who singled me out. She's the one who yelled. I have a right to sit here. I paid for this seat." He yanked the boarding pass from his pocket, crumpled and damp with sweat, thrusting it toward the flight manager with trembling fingers. The manager took it between two pinched fingers like it was dirty. He read it, nodded once. "First class. Yes, I see that." Calvin exhaled in relief for a half second before the man continued. "But you need to understand, sir, that we reserve the right to adjust seating at our discretion for the safety and comfort of all passengers. If you cannot follow crew instructions without making a scene, we can and will downgrade you to economy." Calvin's stomach fell through the floor. He could hardly process the words. Downgrade him? After what he'd paid, after what he'd endured. He felt lightheaded. He tried to protest, but no words came out. He swallowed again, feeling the sharp edge of tears threatening to spill. He blinked them back furiously. He was not going to cry in front of this man. He forced his voice to work, a broken whisper. "I'm sorry if I made anyone uncomfortable. I just want to sit here and not be bothered. Please." The flight manager sniffed, handing the boarding pass back without meeting Calvin's eyes. "We'll allow you to stay for now," he said, voice dripping with forced magnanimity. "But any further issues, any at all, and you'll be escorted to coach." "Understood." Calvin felt something die inside him as he nodded. He lowered his head again, unable to look at the manager, Darla, or any of the passengers who were watching the entire performance with wide, hungry eyes. He felt every ounce of strength drain out of him, replaced by a hollow coldness. The air felt heavy and stifling, filled with the cloying smell of too strong cologne and recycled disappointment, and every whisper, every small laugh, every embarrassed cough from the passengers around him felt like another stone on his back, pushing him down so far he thought he might never get up again. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine the city he was going to, the new job, the promise of a fresh start. But the vision wavered and crumbled like a cheap photograph left in the rain. He felt smaller than he ever had before. He was still trying to calm his ragged breathing when the curtain to the galley rattled open and Darla emerged again, this time with the flight manager right behind her, both wearing expressions carved from cold marble. Calvin flinched at the sight, his gut twisting with dread. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't so much as blinked too hard, but he could see in their eyes that it didn't matter. They'd already decided. The flight manager's voice was oily and false-friendly as he leaned slightly toward Calvin's seat, just enough for everyone nearby to hear without any effort. "Sir, we've had continued reports of discomfort from other passengers," he began, every syllable coated in bureaucratic poison. Calvin's mouth worked silently before he could find words, his voice cracking as he tried to keep it low. "I haven't done anything. I'm just sitting here. I haven't moved." Darla sniffed derisively beside the manager, eyes glinting with mean triumph. The manager didn't even blink. "Regardless," he continued smoothly, "it seems your presence is disrupting the experience we strive to provide in our premium cabin." He said it like Calvin was a malfunctioning piece of luggage they needed to discard. Calvin's vision blurred. He shook his head frantically, the words tumbling out. "I paid for this seat. I didn't break any rules. I just want to sit here quietly." Darla interrupted with a sharp, cruel laugh that turned heads in nearby rows. "Sir, you've made it clear you can't comply with simple instructions," she snapped, the fake politeness falling away. She turned, addressing the manager in a voice pitched just so other passengers could hear. "This is the third time we've had to speak with him. He stood in the aisle. He raised his voice. He refused to follow crew direction." Calvin's heart slammed in his chest, panic turning his blood to ice. "That's not true," he gasped, but his voice was so thin and broken it was pathetic even to his own ears. The manager's eyes hardened. "Sir, we're not going to argue with you any further. For the comfort and safety of our other guests, we're reassigning your seat to economy." The words dropped like an axe. Calvin felt the breath punch out of him. He couldn't even speak at first, could only gape at them, mouth opening and closing like a fish. His hands scrabbled for the boarding pass again, waving it like a useless flag. I paid for this. Please, please don't do this. I didn't do anything wrong." The flight manager's mouth tightened in a humorless line. He extended a hand, palm up, the universal gesture of take it or leave it finality. "Ticket, please," he said flatly. Calvin's fingers went numb. The pass crumpled in his grip. He shook his head slowly, mutely, tears welling again despite his desperate attempt to blink them away. Murmurs rippled through the cabin, people leaning to see, smartphones subtly angled to record as passengers realized they were watching a live scandal unfold. Someone hissed, "Just go already," while another sighed loudly and muttered about how they were going to be late. Calvin felt like he might vomit. Darla folded her arms, the smirk she'd been hiding finally breaking free across her face. She leaned forward enough that only he could hear her next words, voice dripping with poisonous satisfaction. "This is first class. People like you don't know how to act here." Calvin recoiled as if slapped. His vision went white with humiliation and rage that had nowhere to go. He tried one last time, voice shivering and thin, "Please, please don't do this to me." The flight manager gave no sign of hearing. He turned slightly, projecting his voice to the entire cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We're having a minor issue with a passenger refusing to comply with seating requirements. For safety reasons, we're going to move him to an alternate seat in the main cabin." The words rolled out with robotic precision. The safety threat lie pronounced calmly and clearly for everyone to hear. Calvin felt his heart crack. People were watching him like he was a threat, a dangerous inconvenience. He could still feel the heat of the smartphone cameras tracking him as he was marched through the aisle like a criminal in cuffs. Hear the soft gasps and the muttered comments about safety and rules and troublemakers. The boarding pass he had paid too much for was crumpled in his fist, the first-class lettering now wrinkled and mocking. A promise broken so completely it felt like betrayal carved into his skin. He tried not to think about Darla's fingers digging into his arm as she had frog-marched him back here, about her smirk when she let him go like she couldn't stand touching him a moment longer, about the way the flight manager's voice had sounded so smooth, so calm, as he lied over the intercom about a safety threat that didn't exist. Calvin shivered despite the heat of the crowded cabin, the recycled air stale and suffocating. He tried to focus on anything but the sting behind his eyes and the raw scrape of his throat from trying not to cry. He didn't want to see anyone's face, didn't want to see the pity or the gloating, didn't want to see the crew pretending he didn't exist now that he'd been neatly disposed of, a problem removed from their pristine front cabin. He heard the rustle of uniforms before he saw them. He didn't look up, but he felt their presence looming over him. Darla's perfume hit him first, cloying and floral, so strong it made his eyes water even more. He forced his breathing to slow, forced himself not to react as she cleared her throat pointedly. He could see the edge of her navy skirt and the polished toes of her black shoes, planted wide in authority. "Mr. Mercer," she said, voice dripping with false politeness, "I need your attention." He didn't move at first. He couldn't. It was like his body refused to acknowledge her. A wave of nausea rolled through his stomach, but he swallowed it back and slowly raised his head, eyes dull and defeated. Darla was smiling. It was the same smile she had used when she threatened to call security. The same one she'd worn when she whispered that he didn't know how to act in first class. Except now it was softer, gentler, almost sweet, like a teacher talking to a misbehaving child she thought she had finally broken. Beside her was the flight manager, arms crossed, his face set in a mask of bureaucratic condescension. He held a small folder in his hand, white paper visible inside, the edges stiff and crisp. Calvin didn't speak. He didn't trust himself to. Darla made a little show of checking the seat number and nodding as if confirming he was the right one. "Mr. Mercer," she repeated, voice a little louder, so nearby passengers would have no trouble hearing. "Due to your behavior earlier in the flight, we're required to document the incident in your passenger profile." Calvin felt something inside him shrivel. He blinked once, twice, the words not making sense at first. Document? Passenger profile? He felt his stomach drop as understanding hit him like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just humiliating him now. She was branding him, marking him, ensuring that this moment would follow him onto every plane he ever tried to board again. His lips parted, but no sound came out. The flight manager finally spoke, voice deep and slow, reading from the paper like it was scripture. "This is a written warning notice. Mr. Mercer, it will be added to your account with the airline. It states you were non-compliant with crew instructions and created a disturbance in the premium cabin. Future travel may be subject to additional security screening or denial of service if further incidents occur." He stared at it with red, burning eyes, his jaw clenched so tightly that his teeth ached, breath rattling shallowly through flared nostrils. He couldn't hear the flight attendant's cheerful announcements anymore, couldn't hear the baby crying 2 rows back, couldn't hear the casual jokes and impatient sighs of the other passengers. It all blurred into a dull, hateful roar behind his eyes. He felt hollowed out, gutted and scraped raw, like there wasn't anything left of the man who'd boarded the plane hoping for even a scrap of dignity. But somewhere under all that raw, ragged emptiness, there was a slow, steady ember of something else. Something that hadn't died yet, no matter how hard they tried to kill it. He forced himself to breathe, slow and deep. In, out. His fingers uncurled from the warning slip with an audible crackle of torn paper. He blinked at it once, twice, then let it fall to the sticky floor under the seat in front of him. He didn't care if it fluttered under someone else's feet. He didn't care if they stepped on it. It wasn't his shame anymore. He pushed his shoulders back against the cheap seat with excruciating slowness, feeling every muscle scream in protest, and rolled his head on his neck until the tendons cracked. His vision sharpened, pulling back from the tight, suffocating tunnel of pain and humiliation he'd been trapped in for the past hour. He looked to his left. The aisle was busy with the shuffle of passengers settling in, a flight attendant ignoring him entirely as she served drinks with a tight, polite smile. No one was looking at him now. They'd seen the show. They'd had their moment of scandal and moral judgment, whispered their opinions about unruly passengers and safety threats. Now they were done. Now he was invisible again. Perfect. He let his hand slide slowly into the pocket of his cheap, worn-out jeans and wrapped his fingers around the battered plastic shape he'd left there, unnoticed, untouched. The old flip phone was scuffed and faded, the cheap plastic cover cracked near the hinge. But it worked. It always worked. He eased it out carefully, shielding it with his palm as if it were a secret too important to share. He snapped it open with a muffled clack that was lost under the roar of the engines spooling up for takeoff. The tiny green screen lit up dully, numbers waiting. His thumb hovered over the keypad. He didn't type a whole sentence. He didn't need to. He pressed a single contact, marked with a name no one else on this plane would recognize or understand. He waited for the faintest vibration that confirmed the call had connected, the signal bouncing from cell tower to satellite to wherever it needed to go. Then he spoke, voice low and even despite the tremor that tried to crack it. "Pull it." That was all. 2 words. Enough. He didn't wait for the response. He didn't have to. He flipped the phone shut with a decisive snap and dropped it back into his pocket, slumping fully into the seat with a long exhale that trembled at the end. Around him, no one noticed. No one cared. He was just another downtrodden economy passenger now, face gray with exhaustion, eyes shadowed with pain. A man properly in his place. Darla would have been proud. The crying infant behind him had finally quieted to exhausted snuffles. The woman to his left chewed gum like it was her only source of defiance against the indignity of their surroundings. An older man across the aisle had surrendered to sleep, mouth hanging open in a silent snore that matched the drone of the engines. Calvin felt numb. Not calm. He was far from calm, but numb, like his emotions had finally burned themselves out and all that remained was a hollow shell with a heart that beat because it was too stubborn to stop. He was aware of every second, every mile between him and the runway, every vibration of the engines that kept him locked in this cramped purgatory. But inside, deep below the exhaustion and the pain and the shame that clung to him like a second skin, there was that small, steady ember. The same one that had driven his fingers to dial the number. The same one that had made him say it. Pull it. That ember glowed, hot and patient, reminding him that it wasn't over, that they hadn't won. The seatbelt sign flickered on. The cabin lights dimmed to a softer glow. The engines rumbled lower as the plane began its descent. A voice crackled overhead. Darla's voice, bright and professional. syrupy with fake warmth. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbacks and tray tables are in their upright and locked positions. Calvin didn't move. He didn't need to. His tray was already up. He was already locked down, contained, made small enough to suit them. He heard the polite murmurs of compliance, the gentle clacking of plastic as passengers adjusted seats and belts and belongings. He heard Darla's shoes clicking up the aisle, stopping here and there to murmur approvals and corrections. He felt her pause near his row, felt her eyes flick over him, felt the cold satisfaction in her gaze when she saw how thoroughly he'd been put in his place. She said nothing to him this time. She didn't have to. She moved on. He let her. The plane shuddered as its wheels kissed the runway, a heavy, bouncing impact that rattled the overhead bins and made loose drink slosh in plastic cups. Passengers clapped out of reflex, a strange communal ritual of relief that always made Calvin roll his eyes when he wasn't too tired to care. This time, he didn't react at all. The captain's voice followed, muffled but authoritative, welcoming them to their destination with a practiced cadence that did nothing to warm the cold in Calvin's chest. The engines howled and quieted as the plane taxied. The glow of runway lights flashed across the oval windows, stark and sterile. The moment stretched, held. Finally, the plane jerked to a stop, the seatbelt sign chiming off with a happy little ding that felt cruel in its normalcy. There was the usual impatient rustle, passengers twisting to reach overhead bins, elbows knocking, bags thumping. Calvin didn't move. Not yet. He waited. He watched. That was when the first phone went off. A shrill ping from the row ahead. Then another. And another. A wave of chimes and buzzes and synthetic marimba jingles rippled through the cabin like a slow-moving storm. Calvin didn't need to check his own phone. He knew what it was. He saw the woman in front of him freeze, screen glowing in her hand, her eyebrows shooting up as she read the headline that was already racing across news feeds. He saw the businessman in the aisle seat frown, turning his phone slightly so he could read better. He heard the low, disbelieving murmur start to spread, growing and branching like cracks in glass. "Is this real?" someone asked. "Oh my God." "No way." Screens tilted and turned, faces lit in ghostly light as they read it. Airline loses $5.9 billion contract over discrimination incident. Calvin could imagine the words without even seeing them. He'd spent enough years paying PR firms to know exactly how it would look by the time it hit the press. Polished, damning, undeniable. Airline sources confirm abrupt cancellation of $5.9 billion fleet renewal deal. Sources cite incident aboard Flight 217. Passenger profile tagged for non-compliance after repeated crew confrontations. Passenger confirmed to be managing partner at Mercer Capital Investments, primary negotiator of the deal. He felt the words like a bomb on a raw wound. The low murmur of pre-landing chatter had shifted into an urgent, disbelieving clamor. He could hear it build like a rising tide against the hush that had once pinned him in place. People read the headlines out loud without meaning to. 5.9 billion, someone breathed, awe and horror mixed in equal parts. Because of this flight, this one, another voice cut in angry and shrill. They're saying it was racism. On camera. Christ, it's everywhere already. Calvin didn't move. He didn't need to. He could feel the weight of their eyes shifting from their phones to the aisle, to the back, toward the shadowed spot where he sat slumped like a man resigned to his fate. Except now they saw him differently. They couldn't help it. He felt no triumph in it, just an inexorable sense of finality. He let his fingers drum once on his knee before going still again. In the front of the plane, hidden behind that thin curtain, chaos bloomed like wildfire. Darla's voice, once so smug and clipped, cracked through the hush with raw panic. No, listen, I didn't know. I didn't know who he was." She hissed into her headset, her tone frantic and high. The manager's voice, usually low and confident, was now reduced to terse, pleading fragments. "Please, we can fix this. It was a misunderstanding. You have to let me explain." But there was no explanation that would matter anymore. Because at that very moment, The corporate offices of the airline were a storm of flashing screens and shouting executives, PR teams scrambling to triage a fire that was spreading faster than they could contain it. Emails flew like bullets. Legal threatened, then pleaded. The CEO's assistant pounded on the mahogany door to deliver the message no one wanted to hear. The deal was dead. Mercer Capital had pulled out, their statement concise and devastating. We refuse to do business with any company that treats our partners with such disdain and prejudice. The news was a grenade thrown into the delicate ecosystem of corporate trust. Shares in the airline, already wobbling from a bad quarter, plummeted in after hours trading as news outlets picked up the scandal like blood in the water. Airline stock tanks on $5.9 billion loss amid racism claims the banner screamed, flashing across business tickers in ugly red. Commentators lined up to dissect every angle. The financial impact, the PR nightmare, the moral failing. Clips recorded on smartphones of Darla shouting, "Sit down now," and calling him a safety threat played on loop. Framed by talking heads condemning the treatment of a paying first-class passenger whose only crime had been standing to ease an aching back. Calvin could imagine it all without needing to see it. He could hear the angry calls between board members, the threatened lawsuits, the frantic scramble to apologize too late. He could picture the shareholders' rage, the forced smiles at emergency press conferences, the hastily written statements about diversity training and new policies. And he could see the faces of the people who had made this moment inevitable. Darla, standing in that galley now, her headset askew, eyes wide and shiny with tears she hadn't let anyone see until the phone call came in telling her to stay behind after landing. She tried to argue, voice climbing into shrill desperation. "I did my job." He was making people uncomfortable. But the voice on the other end hadn't listened. It had only said, cold and flat, "Pack your things. Don't come back." She would leave through the employee door, avoiding the terminal where cameras waited. Badge turned in, uniform crumpled in her bag, her smile finally gone. The flight manager would fare no better. He was already on his phone, sweating through his suit, voice hoarse as he begged someone in HR not to throw him under the bus. But there was no one left to shield him. The statement had already been drafted by corporate. "We take these allegations seriously. The individuals involved are no longer employed with us." Calvin Mercer stepped off the plane at last, the stale breath of the aircraft giving way to the wider hush of the terminal, where people clustered near arrival screens and sleepy children clung to their parents' legs. And no one knew what had just happened 30,000 feet above their heads. He felt the rattle in his knees from sitting too long, the ache in his back that no amount of standing would ever quite soothe, and the raw, chapped feeling in his throat from swallowing words until they cut. He adjusted the fraying strap of his old canvas backpack over his shoulder and walked with measured steps through the jetway, refusing to glance back even once. No uniformed employee met his gaze. No manager tried to stop him now. No voice called after him to apologize or to scold. They were all too busy behind closed doors, learning just what those two words had set in motion. He didn't smile. Not now. He didn't feel like smiling. He didn't feel anything like triumph. He felt tired, but he also felt certain, because this time they couldn't erase it. They couldn't silence it or push it to the back of the plane. By the time his feet hit the cool tile of the concourse, the story had already gone global. His phone buzzed again and again in his pocket, messages from allies, from reporters, from board members who were only now realizing they'd lost the biggest deal their company would see for decades. He ignored them all for now. He just kept walking, step by step, all the way out of the airport into the pale dawn light of a city that didn't yet know it was waking to news that would rock an industry. Headlines blared across every screen. $5.9 billion deal dead after racial profiling incident. Airline executives forced out amid discrimination scandal. Passenger humiliated. Airline pays the price. Stock tickers crawled red. Analysts stammered about PR disasters and leadership failures. But none of those numbers captured the truth of what had been stolen from him in that aisle. The small, cruel humiliations. The wordless agreement from the cabin that it was okay to treat him like that. That wasn't something he would forgive. But he wasn't looking for revenge. He was looking for change. Across the country, corporate boardrooms filled with frantic calls about damage control and public statements. Press releases were written and rewritten. Legal departments sent red-line drafts back and forth. The airline CEO sat in his glass office in a suit that cost more than Calvin's entire wardrobe, staring at the latest valuation drop on the screen while the general counsel recited words like negligence, systemic bias, and breach of duty. In his ear, the PR lead said they needed to make an offer, that they had to settle before this got worse, that they needed to make it go away. But Calvin didn't want it to go away. When the call finally came to him, days later, after the first round of firings and resignations, after Darla's face had appeared in grainy smartphone videos on every nightly news show, he let them talk. They offered hush money with a desperate politeness that couldn't quite hide its contempt. Millions if he'd sign and promise to stay silent, to let the brand recover, to let them rebuild without owning what they'd done. He listened in silence as they made their case, lawyers trying to spin cruelty into misunderstanding, insisting that no one had meant it that way. When they finally asked if he was willing to accept, he didn't even let them finish. He said no, not a quiet, shameful no, but a clear, calm, decisive one that made the entire call go silent. He told them he didn't want their money. He told them what he wanted instead. And it wasn't small. It wasn't something they could sign quietly and bury in legal filings. He demanded that they fund anti-bias and civil rights training across their entire workforce, designed and delivered by the nonprofit he had funded himself after years of watching the system fail people like him. He demanded they make it public, make it measurable, and make it permanent, with real accountability and independent oversight. He wanted them to commit to change, not just to PR. They balked. They threatened. They offered more money. He didn't flinch. He had already lost everything he could lose on that plane. They had taken his dignity and made a show of it, but they hadn't killed that ember inside him. They couldn't. In the end, they caved. Because the shareholders were screaming, the media was feasting on every new resignation and leaked email, and public trust was a currency they couldn't afford to lose any longer. The CEO announced it himself at the hastily arranged press conference, reading off the promises Calvin had forced them to make. The cameras caught every word. No spin, no evasion, just the reality of what they would have to do to earn a second chance. And somewhere else, on the other side of town, Darla sat alone at a folding table in a community center, watching teenagers file in with battered backpacks, not unlike Calvin's own. She had been fired, sure, but the scandal had followed her into every interview, every reference check, until there was nowhere left to hide it. She didn't talk about the airline anymore. She didn't talk much at all, but she listened. She signed up to volunteer, to tutor, to sit with kids whose faces reminded her of the man she had called a threat. And though she didn't say it out loud, not yet, every lesson she helped with, every resume she edited, every quiet moment she spent trying to help instead of harm was her way of admitting the truth. She had been part of the problem. And Calvin? He didn't see her again. He didn't need to. He didn't want her apology. He didn't want anything from her except for her to change. Because that was the point. It wasn't about one seat or one flight or one humiliation. It was about making sure no one else had to swallow the shame he'd choked on for an entire flight. It was about the next person boarding with a cheap backpack and hope in their chest getting to keep both when they sat down. When he finally stood in front of his team, explaining what came next, he didn't talk about revenge. He talked about accountability, about systems that had to change, about dignity that wasn't negotiable. He told them the cost of silence, and he promised he would never be silent again. The end. If you've stayed with this story all the way to the end, thank you. I hope it made you think about what real accountability can look like, and how a single moment of cruelty can echo further than anyone expects. If you believe stories like this matter, ones about justice, change, and the power of refusing to stay silent, consider giving this a like and subscribing so you don't miss what's next.